In August 1945, Japan lay in complete ruins. 2 atomic bombs, 67 cities destroyed by firebombing, over 3 million dead. The economy shattered, infrastructure obliterated. American generals predicted it would take a century to recover. Yet just 40 years later, Japan became the world's second largest economy, producing the cars you drive and the electronics in your home. This is the untold story of the greatest national recovery in human history. Stay with me. August 15th, 1945. At noon, a voice never before heard by the Japanese public crackles across radio waves throughout the empire. Emperor Hirohito, considered a living god by many Japanese, speaks directly to his people for the first time. His message is delivered in formal court language that most ordinary citizens can barely understand, but its meaning is unmistakable. Japan must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. Japan has surrendered. For the first time in its 2,600-year history, according to Japanese mythology, the island nation has been defeated by a foreign power. But this wasn't just any defeat. This wasn't a setback that could be corrected with better tactics or more resources. This was total, complete, catastrophic destruction on a scale the modern world had never witnessed outside of the Great Plagues of the Middle Ages. The Japan of 1945 was a landscape of nightmares. More than 60 major cities lay in ruins, reduced to ash and twisted metal. Nearly 3 million Japanese were dead, soldiers killed in battle, civilians incinerated in firebombings, families vaporized in atomic blasts. The economy, once the most advanced in Asia, had collapsed so completely that industrial production had fallen to less than 10% of pre-war levels. Actual starvation stalked the streets of cities where children had once played. The proud island nation that had once dreamed of empire, that had challenged the greatest powers on earth, was now a beggar among nations, dependent on the charity of its conquerors even for daily bread. Yet within the lifetime of a single generation, within 40 years, less time than many people spend in their careers, Japan would transform itself from this devastation into an economic giant that would challenge even the United States for global supremacy. Japanese companies would come to dominate industries from automobiles to electronics. Japanese products would become synonymous with quality and innovation. Japanese management techniques would be studied in business schools worldwide. The nation that American planners thought might never recover would become so successful that Americans would fear Japanese economic competition more than they had once feared Japanese military might. The question isn't whether this happened. The historical record is clear. The question that haunts economists, historians, and anyone who studies extraordinary human achievement is simply, how? How does a nation go from atomic ashes to automotive excellence, from devastation to domination, from ruins to riches, from ground zero to number 2? The answer is a story of unlikely allies and former enemies learning to work together. It's a story of perfect timing, where global events created opportunities that Japan was uniquely positioned to seize. It's a story of revolutionary thinking about manufacturing, quality, and continuous improvement. And it's a story of a work ethic and cultural adaptation that would reshape not just Japan, but the entire global economy. This is the story of the greatest economic miracle in human history. This is how Japan did the impossible. To understand the magnitude of Japan's recovery, to truly grasp what was achieved, we first need to understand the depth of its destruction. And the devastation of 1945 Japan was almost incomprehensible, even by the standards of World War II, a conflict that had already killed over 60 million people worldwide. Imagine, if you will, that nearly every major city in your country has been systematically destroyed. Not damaged, not partially ruined, destroyed, erased from the earth as functioning urban centers. That was the reality of Japan in August 1945. The scale of destruction. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a story all their own. The American firebombing campaign, which had begun in earnest in March of 1945, had destroyed approximately 40% of the urban areas in 66 Japanese cities. But this sterile statistic barely hints at the reality. In Tokyo alone, the firebombing of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. Let that sink in for a moment. 100,000 people dead in one night. That's more casualties than either atomic bombing would produce individually. The firestorm generated winds of over 100 miles per hour and temperatures hot enough to boil water in the canals. People who jumped into those canals to escape the flames were boiled alive. Those who sought shelter in concrete buildings were asphyxiated as the fires consumed all the oxygen. The lucky ones died quickly from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Then came Hiroshima. August 6th, 1945, 8:15 in the morning. The atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above the city, instantly killing an estimated 70,000 people and injuring another 70,000. But these numbers are deceptive because many of those injured would die agonizing deaths from radiation poisoning in the weeks and months to come. The city itself was essentially erased. Within a 1-mile radius of ground zero, nearly every structure was obliterated, buildings vaporized, bridges collapsed, trees incinerated. Human beings left nothing but shadows burned into concrete. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered a similar fate. The bomb nicknamed Fat Man detonated over that city, killing another 40,000 instantly and condemning tens of thousands more to slow deaths from radiation. Nagasaki was actually a secondary target. The primary target, Kokura, was obscured by clouds that day. The randomness of this fact, that Nagasaki's fate was sealed by the weather over a different city, speaks to the terrible arbitrary nature of war. But the atomic bombs, as horrific as they were, as much as they would come to symbolize the war's end and the nuclear age's beginning, represented only a fraction of Japan's total losses. The total death toll from the war exceeded 2.7 million Japanese civilians and military personnel. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 4% of the entire population of Japan at the time. Imagine if 1 in every 25 people in your country simply vanished. Gone, dead, every family touched by loss, every community devastated. And these numbers don't include the psychological trauma, the shattered families, the children who watched their parents die, the parents who lost children, the entire generation that grew up knowing only war and defeat and hunger. Economic collapse. The economic devastation was equally catastrophic, though less visually dramatic than the physical destruction. Japan's industrial capacity, built up over decades of modernization, had been systematically gutted. Consider steel production, the backbone of any industrial economy and the foundation of manufacturing power. In 1945, Japanese steel production had collapsed to just 400,000 tons per year. Before the war, it had been over 7 million tons annually. That's a 94% drop in just a few years. 94%. Coal production, essential for powering factories and generating electricity, had similarly collapsed. Oil refineries, already scarce in resource-poor Japan, had been systematically targeted and destroyed by American bombing. The merchant fleet, once the third largest in the world and essential for an island nation dependent on imports, was 90% gone, resting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Of the approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping Japan possessed at the war's peak, only 600,000 tons remained afloat and operational. Without ships, how could Japan import the raw materials it needed? How could it export products even if factories could make them? The transportation infrastructure within Japan itself was shattered. Railroads, the arteries of commerce, were damaged and disrupted. Rolling stock had been destroyed or worn out. Bridges were down, bombed by American air raids. Ports were clogged with wreckage, their cranes toppled, their warehouses burned, their facilities unusable. Even if factories could produce goods, there was simply no way to move them from where they were made to where they were needed. The currency situation was catastrophic. The yen was essentially worthless. Inflation was spiraling completely out of control, reaching several 100% annually in some periods. money printed by the government to finance the war effort and now to pay for occupation costs was flooding the economy faster than goods could be produced. Black markets flourished as the official economy essentially ceased to function. A pack of cigarettes might cost your entire monthly salary if you could find one. A bag of rice might require trading away your family's furniture or heirlooms. Agricultural production had plummeted catastrophically, with millions of men dead or displaced, with fertilizer factories destroyed or converted to munitions production, with distribution networks collapsed, and with the agricultural regions of the empire now lost, Japan could not feed itself. In the winter of 1945 to 46, ordinary Japanese citizens were surviving on rations of less than 1,500 calories per day. For perspective, that's well below the threshold that constitutes starvation. Active adults need roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories daily just to maintain their weight and health. The Japanese were slowly starving. People ate anything they could find. Tree bark was stripped and boiled into soup. Grass was harvested like a crop and consumed. Sawdust was mixed into bread to provide bulk, even though it had virtually no nutritional value. Acorns, normally pig feed, became precious food. Dogs and cats, traditionally not eaten in Japan, disappeared from the streets. In the countryside, farmers who could hide rice from government requisitions found themselves in the unusual position of wealth, while city dwellers who had once looked down on rural life now begged for food. The human cost. Beyond the statistics, beyond the economic data, beyond the tons of steel or calories of food, there was the immeasurable human tragedy. Millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians were stranded across Asia, from Manchuria in the north to the Philippines in the south, from Burma in the west to the Pacific Islands in the east. With the empire's collapse, they had to make their way home to a country that could barely support the people already there. Many died in the attempt. Some wouldn't make it home for years, others would never return. The term war orphan became tragically common in post-war Japan. Estimates suggest over 120,000 children lost both parents during the war and its immediate aftermath. These children, many of them very young, had to survive on the streets of destroyed cities. They begged for food, shined shoes, picked through garbage, and did whatever they could to survive. Some banded together in groups for protection. Others were taken in by relatives or neighbors despite the poverty. Many didn't survive at all. Women faced impossible choices in post-war Japan. With millions of men dead, the gender ratio was severely imbalanced. Economic desperation, combined with the presence of occupation forces with money and supplies, drove many women into prostitution. The so-called pan-pan girls, who frequented American military bases, became a visible symbol of Japan's defeat and humiliation. These weren't women who chose this life. These were women trying to survive and often trying to feed their families in an economy where legitimate work was scarce and wages couldn't buy enough food anyway. The social fabric of Japanese society seemed to be tearing apart under the strain. Traditional values of honor and hierarchy had led the nation into disaster. The military, once revered, was now disbanded and discredited. The emperor, once considered divine, had admitted he was merely human. The promise that Japan would prevail through superior spirit had been proven catastrophically wrong. What could people believe in now? What values could guide them forward? This then was the starting point. This was ground zero. This was the bottom of the pit from which Japan somehow had to climb. From here, Japan had nowhere to go but up. But the climb ahead seemed impossible. The cliff face seemed unscalable. Most foreign observers predicted Japan would remain an impoverished agricultural nation for at least 2 or 3 generations, perhaps forever. Some predicted Japan might fracture into civil war. Others suggested Japan might become a permanent ward of the United States, never truly independent again. They were about to be proven spectacularly, dramatically, incredibly wrong. But Japan's resurrection wouldn't come from within alone. It would require the help of its former enemy, acting in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. Democratic reforms. On August 30th, 1945, 5 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, General Douglas MacArthur landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. He was arriving to oversee the occupation of Japan as the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP as the administration would become known. It was an unprecedented moment in world history. Never before had Japan been successfully invaded, let alone occupied by a foreign power, and what MacArthur and his administration would do over the next 7 years would fundamentally reshape Japanese society in ways that would set the stage, perhaps inadvertently, for the greatest economic miracle in modern history. What makes MacArthur's entrance particularly remarkable is what didn't happen. There was no uprising, no guerrilla resistance, no wave of suicides, despite the fact that Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as barbaric demons who would torture and murder civilians. Instead, there was exhausted compliance and, gradually, curious cooperation. The Japanese people, traumatized by years of war and propaganda that had proven false, were willing to see what came next. MacArthur's occupation was unlike any military occupation in human history, certainly unlike anything seen in the 20th century. Instead of punishing Japan harshly, extracting resources to pay for the war damage, or seeking revenge for Pearl Harbor and the brutal Pacific War, the American policy was fundamentally different. Rebuild Japan as a peaceful, democratic, prosperous nation that could serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in Asia. This was revolutionary thinking for the time, influenced by lessons learned from the harsh treatment of Germany after World War I, which many historians believed had contributed to Hitler's rise. The occupation had several key interconnected goals: demilitarize Japan completely and permanently, democratize its political system from the ground up, break up the concentration of economic power that had supported militarism, revive the economy so Japan could be self-sufficient, and transform Japanese society to make future militarism impossible. Each of these goals would prove crucial to Japan's future economic success, though not always in the ways MacArthur and his planners originally intended. What's truly remarkable about the occupation is that it was relatively benign, especially compared to Soviet occupations in Eastern Europe, or even the harsher aspects of German occupation in the Western zones. Yes, there were war crimes trials. Yes, the military was completely disbanded. Yes, certain political leaders were purged from public life. But there was no mass punishment of the Japanese people for their leaders' crimes. No widespread property confiscation beyond demilitarization. No reparations that would cripple the economy for generations, as had been imposed on Germany after World War I. Instead, there was a genuine, almost idealistic effort to help Japan rebuild into something better than it had been. Why this generosity toward a former enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had committed atrocities across Asia, that had fought with fanatical determination? 3 reasons. First, genuine American idealism about spreading democracy, which shouldn't be dismissed as naive. Many Americans genuinely believed in these principles. Second, practical concerns that a desperately poor, unstable Japan could become a security threat or a burden. And third, emerging Cold War concerns about Soviet influence in Asia, which made a strong, pro-American Japan strategically essential. The new constitution, the centerpiece of MacArthur's reforms, was a new constitution drafted largely by American officials in MacArthur's headquarters in a remarkably short time in February 1946, then presented to the Japanese government and, after some modifications, adopted in 1947. This document would fundamentally transform Japan from an imperial autocracy where the emperor theoretically held absolute power into a parliamentary democracy where sovereignty resided with the people. The new constitution did several revolutionary things that would shape Japan's future in profound ways. First, it stripped Emperor Hirohito of all political power, reducing him from a divine ruler to a purely symbolic figurehead, what the constitution called the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. This was psychologically and politically crucial because it meant Japan's militaristic past couldn't return through imperial authority. The emperor could no longer be used by militarists to justify aggression in his name. The decision to keep Hirohito on the throne rather than try him as a war criminal or force him to abdicate was controversial then and remains debated today. MacArthur made this choice because he believed removing the emperor might trigger chaos or resistance that would make occupation impossible. Whether this was the right decision morally is debatable, but practically, it may have been essential for the occupation's success and Japan's stability during the transition. Second, and perhaps most consequentially for Japan's economic future, Article 9 of the Constitution renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces for offensive warfare. Japan could only maintain a self-defense force limited in size and scope. The actual text states, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes." This was intended to prevent Japanese militarism from ever rising again. But Article 9 had an unexpected economic benefit that would prove enormously important. Japan wouldn't have to spend much money on defense. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, Japan's defense spending remained below 1% of GDP, typically around 0.8 to 0.9%. Meanwhile, the United States spent between 4 and 6% of GDP on defense, and the Soviet Union spent even more. That difference represented enormous resources, potentially trillions of dollars over decades, that Japan could invest in infrastructure, education, technology, and industry instead of weapons, bases, and soldiers. Think about what this meant practically. Every dollar Japan didn't spend on aircraft carriers was a dollar it could spend on factories. Every dollar not spent on fighter jets was a dollar for research and development. Every dollar not spent on military bases was a dollar for schools and universities. This was an enormous competitive advantage, even if it wasn't initially intended as such. Third, the Constitution established robust civil rights and freedoms that hadn't existed in Imperial Japan. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, equality under the law, these weren't just abstract principles but enforceable rights. Perhaps most significantly for the economy, the Constitution mandated gender equality and gave women the right to vote for the first time in Japanese history. In the election of April 1946, 39 women were elected to the Diet, Japan's parliament. This expanded the pool of talent that could contribute to Japan's recovery and unleashed the economic potential of half the population that had been largely excluded from formal economic and political life. These constitutional reforms created the framework for a stable democratic society with protected rights and limited government power. This stability would prove essential for economic development. Investors, both foreign and domestic, need predictable rules and property rights protection. Businesses need to know the government won't arbitrarily seize their assets. Workers need freedom to organize and bargain. All of these require constitutional protections and rule of law. Japan now had these, imposed by occupation, but increasingly embraced by the Japanese people themselves. Land reform. Perhaps the most economically significant reform, the one that most directly affected the most people, was land redistribution. Before the war, most Japanese farmers, about 70%, were tenant farmers working land owned by wealthy landlords. They would plant, tend, and harvest the rice or other crops, but keep only a portion, sometimes less than half, giving the rest to landlords as rent. This semi-feudal system kept the rural population impoverished and powerless, created massive inequality, and meant farmers had no incentive to improve the land since improvements would just benefit landlords. The occupation authorities implemented sweeping land reform between 1947 and 1950. The government forced landlords to sell their land, compensating them with money that inflation rapidly made worthless. This land was then sold cheaply to the tenant farmers who worked it, with generous payment terms that made ownership possible for virtually any farmer. Between 1947 and 1950, approximately 5 million acres were redistributed. By 1950, 90% of farmland was cultivated by owners rather than tenants. This was social engineering on a massive scale. The results were remarkable. This land reform created a class of independent farmers who now had a direct stake in the economic system. They owned their own land. They kept the fruits of their labor. They could invest in improvements knowing they would benefit personally. Rural productivity increased as farmers now had incentives to maximize yields. These farmers became productive members of society, invested in improvements, and formed a stable rural middle class. Many of their children would eventually move to cities to work in factories, but they came from families with assets and stability rather than desperate poverty. The land reform also broke the political and economic power of the old landed elite who had been key supporters of Japanese militarism and imperialism. These wealthy landlords had formed the backbone of rural conservatism and had pushed for expansionist policies to benefit their economic interests. With their economic base destroyed, their political power evaporated. This eliminated a major source of support for potential future militarism. The land reform also broke the political and economic power of the old landed elite who had been key supporters of Japanese militarism and imperialism. These wealthy landlords had formed the backbone of rural conservatism and had pushed for expansionist policies to benefit their economic interests. With their economic base destroyed, their political power evaporated. This eliminated a major source of support for potential future militarism. The land reform created millions of families with a stake in the new democratic system. These families would become a conservative but democratic political force, supporting stability and economic growth rather than military adventures. They would form the base of support for the Liberal Democratic Party that would dominate Japanese politics for decades. This political stability would prove crucial for consistent economic policies and long-term growth. Zaibatsu dissolution. The occupation also attempted to break up the Zaibatsu, the massive family-owned conglomerates that had dominated the Japanese economy before and during the war. Companies like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Yasuda controlled huge swaths of the Japanese economy, with interests spanning banking, trading, manufacturing, shipping, and more. Each Zaibatsu was essentially a private empire, and they had enthusiastically supported Japanese militarism and expansionism because war was profitable for them. The Americans, influenced by antitrust thinking from the New Deal era, wanted to create a more competitive economy by breaking these giants into smaller, independent pieces. The plan was to fragment them, bar the controlling families from management, and prevent reconstruction of the old groups. This was supposed to create robust competition and prevent the concentration of economic power that could support future militarism. The effort was only partially successful and, ironically, the partial failure may have been economically beneficial. The Zaibatsu were indeed broken up. Holding companies were dissolved. Family control was eliminated. Major companies were split apart, but within a few years, as the occupation ended and American attention focused on Cold War concerns rather than Japanese business structures, the pieces began to reassemble, though in new forms. They reformed as keiretsu, looser networks of companies with cross-shareholding, interlocking directorates, and preferential business relationships centered around a main bank. These keiretsu would actually prove crucial to Japan's economic success in ways that occupation planners never anticipated. They provided stability, long-term thinking, patient capital, and mutual support that pure free market competition might not have allowed. A keiretsu company that struggled could receive help from others in the group. Banks would provide capital for long-term projects. Companies could coordinate without direct central control. So the occupation's attempt to impose pure American-style capitalism didn't quite work as planned. But the hybrid result, something between pure markets and centralized control, would prove remarkably effective for rapid industrialization and catching up with the West. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the late 1940s, despite these reforms, Japan remained desperately poor and struggling to survive. The reforms were in place, creating potential for growth. The institutions were being established, but the economy remained broken. Production was still far below pre-war levels. Inflation was rampant. Hunger was still a daily reality for millions. Japan had a foundation now, but it needed a catalyst, a spark to ignite growth. That spark came from the most unexpected source, a war in which Japan didn't fight. June 25th, 1950. In the early morning darkness, 100,000 North Korean People's Army soldiers, backed by Soviet weapons and training, crossed the 38th parallel in a massive invasion of South Korea. What began as a surprise attack would escalate within days into a major war involving the United States, China, the Soviet Union, and forces from multiple nations fighting under the United Nations banner. The Korean War would rage for 3 brutal years, killing millions of Koreans and tens of thousands of foreign soldiers. For the United States and its allies, the Korean War was a Cold War crisis, a test of American resolve against communist expansion. For the people of Korea, it was a national catastrophe that would divide their peninsula for generations. But for Japan, sitting just a few hundred miles away across the Sea of Japan, the Korean War was something entirely unexpected, an economic miracle. The war transformed Japan practically overnight from a defeated enemy into an essential ally, and from an economic basket case into a booming manufacturing hub. Without this war, Japan's recovery might have taken decades longer. With it, Japan had the catalyst it needed to jumpstart its economy into sustained high growth. If you're fascinated by how nations rebuild after catastrophe, hit that subscribe button right now. We explore aftermath stories like this every single week, from the fall of Rome to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, from the end of the British Raj to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Japan as America's supply base. When the Korean War broke out, catching American intelligence almost completely by surprise, the United States faced an immediate and severe logistical problem. American forces in South Korea and Japan were understrength, poorly equipped for a major war, and desperately needed supplies. The logistics of supplying a major war effort from bases halfway around the world in the United States would be nightmarish. Supply lines would stretch across the Pacific, taking weeks for each delivery. Costs would be astronomical. Time was critical. South Korean forces were being routed and pushed back rapidly. The solution was obvious once American planners looked at a map: Japan. Japan was perfectly positioned geographically, just 500 to 700 miles from the Korean peninsula, depending on the departure port. Japan had ports that, while damaged, could be quickly repaired. Japan had railroads that could move goods. And most importantly, Japan had factories, skilled workers, and manufacturing capacity that was sitting idle, starving for orders. The decision was made almost immediately. Use Japan as the supply base for the war effort. American military procurement officers began placing massive orders with Japanese companies. The orders came fast, and they came large. The Americans needed everything: trucks and jeeps, spare parts for vehicles and aircraft, weapons and ammunition, uniforms and boots, construction materials, food supplies, medical equipment, and 1,000 other items required to supply an army in the field. Japanese factories, which had been struggling to find any customers, which had been operating at a fraction of capacity, which had been laying off workers and facing bankruptcy, suddenly had more orders than they could handle. Factory managers who had been contemplating shutting down were now scrambling to reopen production lines and hire workers. The unemployment rate in urban areas began dropping almost immediately. The numbers tell the story of just how massive this stimulus was. During the 3 years of the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, the United States spent approximately $4 billion on procurement in Japan. That's equivalent to well over $40 billion in today's money. And this wasn't aid or charity or loans that would need to be repaid. This was payment for goods and services actually delivered. It represented an enormous injection of hard currency into the Japanese economy at exactly the moment Japan needed it most. Think about what this meant for Japanese companies. A steel mill that had been producing perhaps 10% of capacity suddenly had orders for steel products. A textile factory that had been struggling to find buyers suddenly had contracts for millions of yards of cloth for uniforms. A truck manufacturer on the brink of bankruptcy suddenly had orders for thousands of vehicles. The Korean War procurement didn't just save individual companies, it saved entire industries. Japanese steel mills roared back to life, their furnaces blazing day and night. Steel production increased dramatically, reaching pre-war levels by 1953. Textile factories ran around the clock in multiple shifts. Shipyards that had been silent since the war ended started building vessels again. Not warships, but cargo ships and repair vessels. The unemployment rate dropped sharply. Wages began to rise for the first time since the war. For the first time since 1945, ordinary Japanese people had steady work and enough money to buy food without worrying about starvation. Hope returned. The Toyota story. Let's focus on a specific example that perfectly illustrates how the Korean War saved Japanese industry: Toyota Motor Corporation. In early 1950, just months before the Korean War began, Toyota was in desperate trouble, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The company was drowning in massive debts. It was producing only about 300 vehicles per month, barely enough to keep the lights on. Banks were threatening to cut off credit. Toyota's founder, Kiichiro Toyoda, was considering shutting down the entire company. The situation was so dire that Toyota had been forced to lay off thousands of workers, triggering Japan's first major post-war labor dispute. Then came June 25, 1950, and the Korean War. Suddenly, the United States military urgently needed trucks for the war effort. They needed them immediately. They needed them in large quantities, and Japan was right there, able to produce vehicles and deliver them quickly. The US military placed an order with Toyota for 1,000 trucks, then another order, and another. More orders kept coming. By the end of the Korean War, Toyota had produced many thousands of vehicles for the American military and related contract work. The company went from the edge of bankruptcy to profitability literally within months, but more importantly than the immediate financial salvation, Toyota learned invaluable lessons from this experience. The company learned how to mass-produce vehicles to strict quality standards and tight deadlines that couldn't be missed. American military inspectors were demanding, rejecting vehicles that didn't meet specifications. This forced Toyota to improve quality control and manufacturing processes. Toyota engineers studied American vehicles they were maintaining and repairing, learning about design and engineering practices. The company invested its war procurement profits into new equipment and technology. Toyota emerged from the Korean War not just financially sound, but transformed in capabilities. The lessons learned about quality, reliability, and manufacturing efficiency would prove invaluable in the decades to come when Toyota would compete in global markets, and this pattern repeated across Japanese industry. The Korean War procurement didn't just inject money, it transferred knowledge, set standards, created expectations for quality and reliability, and forced Japanese companies to compete at international levels. Companies that might have failed instead survived and grew stronger. The war gave them time to develop capabilities that would later make them globally competitive. Beyond just manufacturing, the Korean War's impact on Japan went far beyond direct procurement spending, significant as that was. The war fundamentally changed Japan's relationship with the United States and Japan's role in American Cold War strategy in Asia. Before the Korean War, Japan was a defeated enemy being reformed and occupied. After the Korean War began, Japan became strategically essential, the anchor of anti-communist stability in East Asia and America's most important Pacific ally. This strategic importance meant American policy toward Japan shifted fundamentally. The earlier emphasis on reform and preventing Japanese militarism gave way to a new emphasis on actively promoting Japan's economic growth and stability. A prosperous, stable, pro-American Japan became a primary American goal because such a Japan would be a reliable ally and a successful showcase for capitalism in Asia, contrasting with communist alternatives. This meant more favorable trade terms with the United States. It meant American technical assistance and technology transfers. It meant American advisors helping Japanese companies adopt modern management techniques and quality control systems. It meant preferential access to American markets for Japanese exports. The United States actively wanted Japan to succeed economically and was willing to help make that happen because American policymakers understood that Japan's economic success served American strategic interests. The Korean War also ended in armistice rather than a peace treaty in July 1953, meaning technically the war never ended. It was merely suspended. This meant American forces would remain stationed in both Japan and South Korea indefinitely, creating a permanent American military presence in Northeast Asia. For Japan, this American military presence meant something crucial. The United States would defend Japan against potential threats, particularly from the Soviet Union or Communist China. This American security guarantee freed Japan from needing a large military budget. Remember, the Constitution already limited Japan's military to self-defense only. Now circumstances and American military presence made that limitation an advantage rather than a vulnerability. Japan didn't need to spend heavily on defense because America provided that defense as part of the alliance. The resources Japan saved on defense could instead fuel economic growth. By the time the Korean War ended in 1953 with the armistice at Panmunjom, Japan was no longer a devastated nation dependent on charity and uncertain about its future. It was a growing industrial power with momentum, confidence, and direction. Industrial production had reached and exceeded pre-war levels. People had jobs, stomachs were full, the economy was growing at rates that surprised everyone. The question now was whether Japan could sustain that growth, whether the Korean War boom was just a temporary spike or the beginning of something larger. The answer would be yes, but it would require revolutionary thinking about manufacturing, quality, and continuous improvement that would transform not just Japan, but eventually global industry. In the 1950s and 60s, something remarkable happened to the phrase "made in Japan." It underwent a complete transformation in global perception. It went from being a joke, a synonym for cheap and shoddy merchandise, to being a mark of quality and reliability. This transformation didn't happen by accident or luck. It was the result of deliberate strategy, cultural adaptation of foreign ideas, and revolutionary manufacturing techniques that would change global industry forever and reshape how products are made everywhere in the world. The quality problem. In the immediate post-war years and into the early 1950s, Japanese products had an absolutely terrible reputation in global markets. Made in Japan was practically a punchline. It meant cheap, shoddy merchandise that would break quickly and disappoint buyers. Japanese toys broke easily. Japanese electronics worked poorly if they worked at all. Japanese textiles fell apart. When Americans or Europeans thought of Japanese products, they thought of tin trinkets sold in dime stores, copies of Western products that were inferior to the originals in every way. And here's the thing, this terrible reputation wasn't just unfair perception or prejudice against Japan. It was largely accurate. Japanese manufacturers in the late 1940s and early 1950s, desperate for foreign currency and trying to rebuild any kind of export business, were flooding markets with low-quality products made as cheaply as possible. The strategy was to compete on price since they couldn't compete on quality or brand recognition. Make it cheap, sell it cheap, and at least bring in some revenue. In the short term, this strategy brought in some desperately needed foreign currency. But in the longer term, it was destroying Japan's reputation and severely limiting its economic potential. You could only sell so much cheap junk before customers stopped buying entirely. Japanese exports were hitting a ceiling. Meanwhile, Western manufacturers dominated the market for quality goods where the real profits and growth potential lay. By the mid-1950s, forward-thinking Japanese business leaders recognized this was completely unsustainable. To compete globally and achieve real prosperity, Japan needed to move upmarket. Japan needed to produce quality products that could rival or exceed Western manufacturers in reliability, performance, and durability. But this seemed almost impossible. How could Japan, so recently devastated, compete with Western companies that had decades or centuries of experience and established reputations? The problem wasn't lazy workers. Japanese workers were working incredibly hard for low wages. The problem wasn't incompetent engineers. Japan had skilled technical people. The problem was systemic. Japanese companies needed to fundamentally change how they thought about manufacturing, quality, and the entire production process. They needed a revolution in thinking, and the seeds of that revolution came from the most unlikely source, an American statistician whom American companies had largely ignored. In 1950, W. Edwards Deming was invited to Japan by the Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers to teach statistical quality control. Deming was a respected expert in statistical methods, but American companies had shown relatively little interest in his ideas about quality management. The Japanese, desperate to learn anything that might help them improve, listened to Deming with intense attention. And more importantly, they actually implemented his ideas, something American companies had largely failed to do. The Deming Revolution, 1015 to 11. Deming's philosophy was revolutionary because it attacked the fundamental assumptions about quality that dominated manufacturing worldwide. The conventional wisdom in most factories was that quality should be inspected into products at the end of the manufacturing process. You make products as fast as possible, then inspect them at the end, throwing away or reworking the defects. The faster you make things, the more you produce, the more profit you make, even if some percentage are defective. Deming said this was completely backwards. Quality, he argued, should be built into every step of the process from the very beginning. Don't wait until the end to find defects. Prevent defects from happening in the first place. Workers should be empowered to identify problems and fix them immediately, rather than just working faster. Management should focus on improving processes rather than blaming workers when defects occur. Companies should think long-term, investing in quality improvement rather than chasing short-term profits through faster production of potentially defective goods. Japanese companies embraced these ideas with remarkable enthusiasm and thoroughness. They developed the concept of Kaizen, which translates roughly as continuous improvement. Kaizen meant that every worker, from the factory floor sweeper to the executive suite, was encouraged and expected to constantly look for ways to improve processes, reduce waste, and enhance quality. This wasn't a one-time initiative or a special program. It was supposed to be a permanent mindset, a way of thinking that never stopped. Companies held regular quality circles where small groups of workers would meet to discuss problems, share observations, and suggest improvements. These weren't just talking sessions or morale builders. They were practical problem-solving meetings. When a quality circle suggested an improvement that worked, it would be documented, tested, and then implemented across the entire company, or even shared with other companies. Over time, these small improvements accumulated into major competitive advantages. Toyota became the most famous practitioner of these principles, developing what became known as the Toyota production system, which would later be studied worldwide as lean manufacturing. The core philosophy was elegant in its simplicity. Eliminate waste in all its forms. Waste isn't just defective products. It's also excess inventory sitting in warehouses, time spent waiting for parts, unnecessary motion, overproduction, and any activity that doesn't add value from the customer's perspective. Don't produce more inventory than immediately needed, because excess inventory ties up capital and warehouse space while adding no value. Don't wait for parts. Coordinate with suppliers so parts arrive exactly when needed. Don't make defective products that will need to be reworked or scrapped. Every action, every movement, every process step should add value. If it doesn't add value, eliminate it or improve it until it does. This systematic elimination of waste made Japanese factories far more efficient than competitors who hadn't adopted these methods. Another Japanese innovation that emerged from this thinking was just-in-time manufacturing, or JIT. Instead of traditional manufacturing, where factories stockpiled huge inventories of parts, just in case they might be needed, just to be safe, Japanese companies coordinated precisely with suppliers to deliver parts exactly when needed for production. A car seat doesn't sit in your warehouse for weeks. It arrives the morning it's needed and goes directly onto the assembly line. This required sophisticated logistics, reliable suppliers, and precise coordination that many Western manufacturers thought impossible to achieve consistently. But when it worked, and Japanese companies made it work, it was dramatically more efficient than traditional manufacturing. Capital wasn't tied up in inventory. Warehouse space wasn't needed for storage. Problems with parts were discovered immediately, rather than months later when you finally used that stockpiled inventory. The system was lean, efficient, and remarkably effective. Japanese companies also pioneered what became known as total quality management. Instead of having a separate quality control department that inspected finished products at the end of the line, every worker throughout the process was made responsible for quality. If someone spotted a defect or even a potential problem, they were not just allowed but expected to stop the entire production line to fix it. In most Western factories at the time, stopping the production line was almost unthinkable. Production targets had to be met, stopping meant falling behind. Supervisors would be furious. But in Japanese factories implementing total quality management, stopping the line became standard practice. The reasoning was simple and logical. It's better to stop for 5 minutes and fix a problem than to produce hundreds or thousands of defective products before discovering the issue at final inspection. Over time, problems got fixed permanently rather than recurring. Quality improved continuously. Defect rates dropped dramatically. The results of this manufacturing revolution spoke for themselves with undeniable clarity. By the early 1960s, Japanese products were becoming competitive with Western products in quality, not just price. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Japanese products were often superior in reliability and durability. The reputation of "Made in Japan" had completely transformed. Japanese cars lasted longer and needed fewer repairs than comparable American or European cars. Consumer Reports and similar testing organizations consistently rated Japanese vehicles as more reliable. Japanese electronics, radios, televisions, stereos, eventually VCRs, worked more reliably and lasted longer than Western competitors. Japanese cameras, particularly those made by Canon and Nikon, became the professional standard worldwide, displacing German manufacturers that had dominated for decades. Consider the automobile industry specifically, because it perfectly illustrates Japan's transformation. In 1960, Japan produced only about 165,000 passenger cars for the entire year, and almost none were exported because nobody wanted them. Japanese cars were seen as tiny, underpowered, unreliable toys, but Japanese automakers were learning, improving, applying Kaizen and the Toyota production system and just-in-time manufacturing. By 1970, Japan was producing more than 3 million cars annually, with exports growing rapidly. By 1980, Japan was producing over 11 million cars per year and had become the world's largest automobile exporter, surpassing traditional automotive powers like the United States, Germany, and France. Toyota, Nissan, Honda, and Mazda weren't just competing with American and European car makers anymore. They were beating them decisively on quality, reliability, and increasingly on innovation. The 1973 oil crisis accelerated this trend dramatically. When oil prices quadrupled almost overnight, suddenly fuel efficiency mattered enormously to car buyers. Japanese manufacturers, which had been making smaller, more fuel-efficient cars partly because of Japan's own expensive gasoline, were perfectly positioned. American manufacturers focused on large, powerful, gas-guzzling vehicles were caught completely flat-footed. Japanese car sales in America exploded. Or look at consumer electronics, another industry where Japan came to dominate. Sony, founded in 1946 in a bombed-out department store by Masaru Ibuka and Akio Morita with almost no capital, became a global giant by the 1970s. The Sony Walkman, introduced in 1979, didn't just dominate a market, it created an entire new category of personal portable music that hadn't existed before. Japanese companies dominated televisions, radios, stereos, and later VCRS and CD players. This manufacturing revolution was powered by more than just clever techniques and quality control methods, important as those were. It required an educated workforce that could understand statistical methods and suggest sophisticated improvements. It required heavy investment in modern equipment and technology, with companies plowing profits back into capital improvements rather than just distributing them to owners. And it drew on cultural elements that resonated with traditional Japanese values in ways that gave Japan unique advantages. The same society that had perfected tea ceremonies requiring decades to master, that had refined flower arrangement into a sophisticated art form, that had developed exquisitely detailed woodblock prints, that valued craftsmanship and attention to detail as expressions of cultural identity, that society now applied that traditional perfectionism to modern manufacturing. The cultural emphasis on mastery, on doing things correctly, on continuous refinement, fit naturally with Deming's ideas and Kaizen philosophy. Japanese manufacturing also benefited from cultural practices around employment and labor relations. The lifetime employment system, where workers expected to stay with one company for their entire career, meant companies were willing to invest heavily in training because they'd recapture that investment over decades. It meant workers were deeply invested in their company's success because their own long-term prosperity depended on it. It meant labor and management saw themselves as partners rather than adversaries, making cooperation easier than in the more confrontational labor relations common in the West. Now, we should note that this system had significant drawbacks that would become more apparent later. It reduced worker mobility and individual freedom. It could be suffocating for people who didn't fit the corporate culture. It often excluded women from these career paths. It would prove unsustainable in the long term. But during Japan's high-growth decades from the 1950s through the 1980s, it provided real competitive advantages in building skilled, loyal, committed workforces. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Made in Japan had been utterly transformed in global perception. It had gone from a punchline to a selling point. Japanese products commanded premium prices. Consumers actively sought out Japanese brands, and Japanese manufacturing techniques were being studied and copied by companies worldwide. The question now was, could Japan sustain this success? Could it compete not just in manufacturing, but across the entire economy? Could Japan actually challenge the United States for global economic supremacy? The 1980s would provide an answer that would astonish the world. The 1980s were Japan's moment of absolute triumph, the culmination of 40 years of extraordinary effort and transformation. The island nation that had been utterly devastated in 1945 was now unquestionably the world's second largest economy, trailing only the United States and leaving every other nation far behind. Japanese companies were buying famous American real estate and businesses in deals that made headlines worldwide. Japanese banks had become the world's largest by assets, dominating global finance. American business schools, once confident in American business superiority, were now teaching Japanese management techniques to their students. Business books about Japanese success filled bestseller lists. Japan, it seemed, had figured out how to do capitalism better than the Western capitalists who invented it. Let's examine the numbers, because they tell a story that still seems almost impossible despite being thoroughly documented. Between 1960 and 1980, Japan's economy grew at an average annual rate of approximately 10% in real terms, adjusted for inflation. Just think about that for a moment. 10% average annual growth sustained for 2 decades. That's unprecedented economic growth at a pace that seemed to defy economic theory. By comparison, the United States, the world's largest economy and leader of the capitalist world, was growing at about 3 to 3.5% per year during the same period, which was considered healthy and normal. In 1960, Japan's total gross domestic product was approximately $44 billion, making it a significant but not dominant economy, ranking 5th or 6th globally. By 1970, it had tripled to about $200 billion. By 1980, it exceeded $1 trillion for the first time. By 1990, Japan's economy approached $3 trillion. Japan had gone from post-war ruins to an economic giant that produced more than all but one other nation in just 45 years. To put this in historical perspective, this was the most rapid economic growth any nation had ever achieved, starting from a developed baseline. Yes, some nations have grown faster, starting from near zero, but Japan grew from an already industrialized economy that had been destroyed back to global leadership. This was unprecedented in economic history and remains one of the most studied phenomena in development economics. Japanese per capita income, which had been among the lowest in the developed world in 1950, below Italy, well below the United States and Northern Europe, now rivaled or exceeded most Western nations. By the late 1980s, Japanese per capita GDP was approaching American levels and exceeding most of Europe. The average Japanese citizen enjoyed a standard of living comparable to or better than citizens of nations that had never been devastated by war. This transformation within a single lifetime was unprecedented. But it wasn't just overall economic size or average prosperity. Japan was dominating specific industries with market shares that seemed almost monopolistic. In automobiles, Japanese companies accounted for approximately 30% of global production by the mid-1980s and were still gaining share. In consumer electronics, the market share was even higher. Japanese companies controlled over 50% of global production of televisions, 60 to 70% of VCRs, and even higher percentages of cameras and audio equipment. Japanese steel production had become the most efficient in the world. Japanese shipbuilding dominated global markets. Japanese machine tools were setting quality standards. In industry after industry, made in Japan meant the best in the world, and customers were willing to pay premium prices for that quality. And here's what made Japan's success even more remarkable. By the 1980s, Japan wasn't just manufacturing products designed elsewhere or copying Western technology. Japanese companies had become technology leaders, innovators creating new products and new industries rather than just following Western examples. Sony pioneered the Walkman in 1979, creating the entire personal audio market that hadn't existed before. This wasn't an incremental improvement of existing technology. It was genuine innovation that changed how people experienced music. Nintendo revolutionized video games with the Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid-1980s, reviving an industry that had crashed in America and establishing Japanese dominance in gaming that continues today. Japanese companies led the world in robotics and factory automation. By the mid-1980s, Japan had more industrial robots installed than the entire rest of the world combined. These robots weren't just improving productivity, they were changing what manufacturing meant, enabling precision and consistency that human workers couldn't match while freeing humans for more complex tasks. In semiconductors and electronics, Japanese companies challenged and in many cases surpassed American technological dominance. Companies like Toshiba, NEC, Hitachi, and Fujitsu became major players in memory chips, microprocessors, and other semiconductor products. By the mid to late 1980s, Japanese companies controlled over 50% of the global semiconductor market, up from virtually zero in the 1960s. This was a strategic industry that Americans had pioneered and dominated, but Japan had caught up and surpassed them through intensive investment and quality focus. Japanese companies were filing patents at an astonishing rate that alarmed American competitors. In certain technology categories, more patents were being filed by Japanese companies than by American ones. This was remarkable because it showed Japan wasn't just copying or licensing Western technology anymore, which had been the pattern earlier. Japan was creating new technology, new intellectual property, new innovations that other nations would need to license from Japan. The quality of Japanese products in the 1980s had become genuinely legendary. Independent studies found that Japanese cars had dramatically fewer defects than comparable American models, not just slightly fewer, but an order of magnitude fewer. Some Japanese factories achieved defect rates measured in parts per million rather than parts per hundred, quality levels that Western manufacturers have thought theoretically impossible. Consumer electronics from Japanese manufacturers simply lasted longer and broke less frequently than competitors' products. Japan's manufacturing prowess was impressive, but its financial sector had become equally dominant and in some ways more concerning to the rest of the world. Japanese banks, backed by high domestic savings rates that exceeded 20% of income, strong economic growth, and appreciating asset values, became the world's largest by total assets. In 1988, an almost unbelievable fact emerged. The world's top 10 banks by assets were all Japanese. Not one American bank, not one European bank, all 10 were Japanese. The Tokyo Stock Exchange rivaled and at times exceeded New York as the world's most valuable stock market. Japanese government bonds were considered among the safest investments globally. The yen was becoming a major international reserve currency alongside the dollar. Japan was transforming into a financial superpower to match its manufacturing prowess. Flush with cash and confidence, Japanese companies and investors went on an international shopping spree that captured global attention and generated significant anxiety, particularly in the United States. In 1989, Mitsubishi Estate Company bought an 80% stake in New York's iconic Rockefeller Center for over $1 billion. Sony Corporation bought Columbia Pictures for $3.4 billion. Matsushita bought MCA, the parent company of Universal Studios, for over $6 billion. Japanese investors bought prime real estate in Hawaii, California, and other states. In some American cities, Japanese companies became the largest foreign landowners. Golf courses were purchased, hotels were acquired, office buildings changed hands. Each new purchase generated headlines and commentary about Japanese economic power and American economic decline. This international buying spree caused genuine anxiety in the United States and other Western nations. Books with alarmist titles became bestsellers. Japan as Number One, published in 1979 by Harvard professor Ezra Vogel, analyzed the Japanese success and asked whether America could learn from it. The Japan That Can Say No, co-authored by Sony chairman Akio Morita and politician Shintaro Ishihara in 1989, argued that Japan should be more assertive in international relations. American politicians worried loudly about Japanese competition. Trade tensions increased as the US trade deficit with Japan grew larger every year, exceeding $50 billion annually by the late 1980s. There were calls for protectionist measures. Some Americans genuinely feared that Japan was winning economically what it had lost militarily in World War II. The phrase "economic Pearl Harbor" was used, distastefully but revealing the anxiety. The late 1980s represented the absolute peak of Japanese economic power and confidence, a moment when it seemed Japan's rise was not just continuing but might be unstoppable. The economy was booming with growth rates still impressive even if slowing from the incredible pace of earlier decades. The stock market was soaring to heights that would look absurd in retrospect. Real estate prices in Tokyo and other major cities reached levels that defied rational explanation or justification. By 1989, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo were theoretically worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. Think about that. The land under one building complex, important historically but not particularly large, was supposedly worth more than millions of properties across America's most populous and economically important state. Real estate prices had completely detached from any economic fundamental. It seemed Japan's rise was unstoppable, inevitable, that within another decade or two, Japan might actually surpass the United States to become the world's largest economy. Futurists and economists seriously discussed when, not if, this would happen. Japanese companies were seen as invincible. Japanese methods were seen as superior. The 21st century, many predicted, would be Japan's century just as the 20th had been America's. But there were warning signs that few people noticed or took seriously at the time, signs that would become obvious only in hindsight. Asset prices, stocks, and especially real estate were inflating into a massive bubble divorced from underlying economic value. Corporate debt was growing as companies borrowed heavily to invest in expansion and speculation. Banks were making increasingly risky loans backed by overvalued collateral. The very close relationships between banks and corporations that had been a strength were becoming a weakness, as banks made loans based on relationships rather than rigorous analysis of risk. The emphasis on consensus and harmony that had enabled cooperation was also preventing people from speaking up about problems or challenging group decisions. The lifetime employment system that had built loyalty was creating rigidity and inability to adapt. The government-business cooperation that had guided development was now protecting inefficient sectors from needed competition. Success was breeding complacency. The bubble would burst starting in 1990, when the Bank of Japan raised interest rates to cool speculation. Stock prices would crash, real estate prices would collapse, banks would be revealed to be carrying massive portfolios of bad loans. The economy would enter what became known as the lost decade, though it would actually be decades plural of stagnation. But that story of Japan's struggles, while important, is for another time and a different documentary. For now, for this story, let's focus on the positive, the lessons that can be learned from Japan's unprecedented rise from devastation to economic superpower. Because regardless of what came after, the achievement itself remains one of the most remarkable in economic history, and the lessons from that achievement remain valuable. So what can we learn from Japan's incredible recovery? How did a nation go from atomic ruins to economic superpower in just 40 years? What lessons does this story hold for other nations facing crises, for companies trying to recover from disasters, or even for individuals dealing with personal catastrophes? The answer isn't simple. It never is with complex historical phenomena. But there are clear lessons that emerge from Japan's story, lessons that apply beyond economics and beyond Japan itself. Lesson 1. Institutions matter enormously. First, and perhaps most fundamentally, institutions matter enormously. The democratic reforms imposed during the occupation created a stable political system that protected property rights, established rule of law, limited government power, and enabled social mobility. The new constitution provided a framework for stable governance and protected individual rights. The land reform broke feudal structures and created a broad middle class with stakes in the system. The reform of the education system ensured widespread literacy and skill development. These institutions provided the essential foundation for economic growth. Without political stability, without clear property rights that let people know they'll keep what they earn and create, without rule of law that makes contracts enforceable, without democratic processes that allow peaceful resolution of conflicts, Japan's economic miracle wouldn't have been possible. Countries that fail to develop strong institutions struggle to achieve sustained growth, no matter how hard their people work, no matter what resources they have, no matter how much foreign aid they receive. The lesson here is universal. Whether you're rebuilding a nation after war, restructuring a company after bankruptcy, or rebuilding your own life after personal disaster, start by building strong foundations. Create systems and structures that will support growth. Establish clear rules that people can count on. Don't just chase quick wins or short-term gains. Invest time and effort in building institutions, rules, systems, processes, culture that will support sustainable long-term success. Lesson 2. Invest in people. Second, invest heavily in people and human capital. Even in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when Japan was desperately poor and struggling to feed its population, it maintained high literacy rates and continued investing in education at all levels. This paid enormous dividends later. By the 1960s and 70s, Japan had one of the most educated workforces in the world, capable of learning complex manufacturing techniques, implementing quality control systems, and eventually innovating rather than just copying. Japanese companies also invested heavily in their workers through extensive training programs and the lifetime employment system that encouraged long-term skill development. While that specific system had drawbacks and proved unsustainable, the principle was sound. Investing in developing people's skills and capabilities pays off over time in productivity, quality, and innovation. The broader lesson is that investing in people pays long-term dividends that compound over time. Skills, knowledge, and human capital are ultimately the foundation of any advanced economy or successful organization. A nation can lose factories and infrastructure to war or disaster, but if its people are educated, skilled, and healthy, it can rebuild. This is why both Germany and Japan recovered from World War II, while some nations rich in natural resources have remained poor. Human capital matters more than natural resources. Lesson 3. Timing and luck matter. Third, and this is crucial to remember, timing and luck played significant roles that shouldn't be ignored or minimized. The Korean War happened at exactly the right moment to jumpstart Japan's economy. The Cold War made the United States want Japan to succeed strategically. The global economy was expanding throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, creating opportunities for export-oriented growth that might not have existed at other times. The Bretton Woods system kept exchange rates stable, facilitating trade. Japan also benefited significantly from being a late industrializer, able to learn from others' mistakes and adopt the latest technologies without being locked into older systems and infrastructure. Japanese companies could study Western manufacturing methods, identify what worked and what didn't, take the best practices, improve on them, and implement superior systems without having to transition from established but inferior methods. The lesson isn't that success is just luck. Japan made its own luck through preparation and hard work, but the lesson is that you should position yourself to take advantage of opportunities when they arise. Japan was ready when the Korean War created demand. The institutional reforms were in place. The workforce was educated. When opportunity knocked, Japan could answer the door. Luck favors the prepared. You can't control what opportunities will come, but you can prepare yourself to seize them when they do. Lesson 4. Culture matters but can adapt. Fourth, culture matters but it isn't deterministic or unchangeable. Japanese culture adapted traditional values to modern industrial capitalism in powerful ways. The traditional emphasis on craftsmanship and attention to detail translated naturally into modern quality control and continuous improvement. The cultural value placed on harmony and consensus enabled the kind of labor management cooperation that made quality circles and Kaizen work effectively. The concept of long-term relationships, important in traditional Japanese society, applied to business, created stable networks of companies that could coordinate complex supply chains and support each other through difficulties. But Japan also showed remarkable cultural flexibility and openness to learning from others. The willingness to study foreign ideas, to adopt what worked even if it came from abroad, to send engineers overseas to learn and bring knowledge back, to fundamentally question and change traditional practices when necessary. This intellectual openness and cultural adaptability was crucial to success. The lesson is that cultural identity and modernization don't have to conflict. You can maintain valuable aspects of your cultural heritage while adopting practices from other cultures that work better. The key is selective adaptation. Keep what's valuable and relevant from your traditions, enthusiastically adopt what works from others, regardless of origin, and create something new that combines the best of both. Cultural pride shouldn't mean cultural rigidity. Real strength comes from synthesis and adaptation. Lesson 5. Government and markets can work together. Fifth, Japan demonstrated that government and markets can work together effectively when properly balanced. Japan was never a pure free market economy in the ideological sense. The government, through agencies like the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, actively shaped industrial policy. It protected infant industries from overwhelming foreign competition until they could compete. It coordinated investment to avoid wasteful duplication. It facilitated technology transfer from abroad. It guided credit allocation to priority industries. But Japan also wasn't a command economy where government bureaucrats made detailed decisions. Private companies competed fiercely with each other. Market mechanisms allocated most resources. Innovation came from companies responding to market demands, not from government plans. The government set broad strategies, provided support and coordination, but companies executed and competed. It was a partnership model, neither pure free market nor pure government control. Now, economists still debate how important government industrial policy actually was to Japan's success. Some argue markets did most of the work, and government just provided stability. Others argue government guidance was crucial. The truth probably lies between these extremes. And it's worth noting that this model had flaws that became more apparent later: government protection of inefficient sectors, difficulty responding to changing conditions, sometimes picking losers rather than winners. But the pragmatic lesson is this: ideological purity matters less than what actually works in your particular context. Different situations require different approaches. The key is maintaining the right balance: enough government to provide stability, coordination, and long-term perspective, but enough market competition to drive efficiency and innovation. Too much of either, and the system breaks down. The ultimate lesson. But perhaps the ultimate lesson, the one that transcends economics and applies to any kind of recovery from disaster, is simply this: catastrophic failure is not permanent. Total destruction is not the end. With the right combination of institutions, investments, timing, culture, and policies, even the most devastating setbacks can be overcome. Nothing is irreversible if people are willing to change, work hard, and persist. In August 1945, Japan had suffered what seemed like irrecoverable losses. Cities destroyed by firebombing and atomic weapons, millions dead, industrial capacity gutted, international reputation ruined, people literally starving in the streets, currency worthless, infrastructure shattered. Any reasonable person surveying Japan in 1945 would have predicted generations of poverty, weakness, and dependence. The damage seemed too severe, too complete, too overwhelming to possibly recover from within any reasonable time frame. Yet 4 decades later, just 40 years, within the lifetime of a single generation, Japan was the world's second largest economy. Those starving children of 1945 were prosperous middle-class adults by 1985. Those destroyed cities had been rebuilt into gleaming modern metropolises. Those bankrupt companies had become global giants. The impossible had become real. The unthinkable had been achieved. If Japan could rise from literal atomic ruins to global economic dominance, then surely other nations facing catastrophes, surely companies facing bankruptcies, surely individuals facing personal disasters can find hope and inspiration in that example. Final thoughts. Of course, we should acknowledge that Japan's story didn't end in 1990 at its peak. The bubble burst, the lost decades followed. Japan today faces serious challenges: an aging and declining population, massive government debt, competition from China and other Asian nations, social problems that weren't evident during the high-growth years. The Japan of today struggles with issues that seemed unthinkable during the boom years. Economic growth has been sluggish for 3 decades now. The confident assumption that Japan would overtake the United States proved wrong. But even accounting for later problems and the painful aftermath of the bubble, even acknowledging that Japan's model proved unsustainable in its specific form, Japan's post-war recovery remains one of the most remarkable achievements in economic history. from total destruction to the world's second largest economy in 40 years, from made in Japan as a joke to made in Japan as a global standard of quality, from defeated enemy to essential ally and economic powerhouse, from ashes to excellence. The magnitude of this achievement remains breathtaking regardless of what came after. This is a story that historians, economists, and anyone interested in human achievement will study for centuries as an example of what's possible when a nation refuses to accept defeat, when it's willing to learn from anyone including former enemies, when it invests in its people and institutions, when it gets the fundamentals right, when it's both willing to change and able to maintain what's valuable, and when determination meets opportunity. Japan proved that no disaster, however complete, need be permanent. That's a lesson worth remembering. Japan's recovery from total destruction holds powerful lessons for our world today, but this isn't the only aftermath story worth telling. History is full of empires, nations, and civilizations that collapsed and had to rebuild, or failed to rebuild. Which collapsed empire or nation should we cover next? The fall and aftermath of the Soviet Union, the Ottoman Empire's end and its successor states, the partition of India, the collapse of Yugoslavia? Comment below with your choice and tell us why that story matters to you. And if you want to understand what really happens after the battles end, when the empires fall, when the old order collapses, subscribe to Aftermath History. We release new episodes every single week exploring what comes after the endings. I'll see you in the next one.